Looking at the history of world culture, there are countless thieves and heroes, but the British Robin Hood must be the most famous. But do you know which legends about Robin Hood are based on facts? Which ones are fictional? Today let's talk about the story of Robin Hood. Please help share and subscribe to the Earth Archives channel before the show starts. Legend has it that Robin Hood was an outlaw living in Sherwood Forest with his merry men, but did he really exist? There are several versions of the Robin Hood story. The Hollywood one is that of an incredibly handsome man, Errol Flynn, clothed in garments of Lincoln green, fighting for the rights of the oppressed and outwitting the evil Sheriff of Nottingham. However, the first known literary reference to Robin Hood and his men was in 1377, and the Sloane manuscripts in the British Museum have an account of Robin's life which states that he was born around 1160 in Lockerslie, most likely modern-day Loxley, in South Yorkshire. Another chronicler has it that he was a Wakefield man and took part in Thomas of Lancaster's rebellion in 1322. One certain fact is that he was a North Country man, with his traditional haunts as an outlaw in Sherwood Forest and a coastal refuge at Robin Hood's Bay in Yorkshire. The first known written account of Robin Hood is by William Langland in 1377. In a work called Piers Plowman, Langland makes a fleeting statement regarding the rhymes of Robin Hood. Historians believe the rhymes spoken of were the ballads, or songs, that were sung about Robin to memorialize him. You see, back then people learned and repeated things more by mouth than by writing them down. Putting poems to song made them easier to remember and made them more entertaining. But it may interest you to know that none of the early ballads of Robin said anything about him taking money from the rich to give to the poor. Nor do they mention Jolly Friar Tuck, Maid Marian, or Richard the Lionheart. The early ballads do, however, mention Little John. It seems that Robin and Little John became acquainted through a playful fight with one another. In the end, they became dear friends and joined together as outlaws with many other men. An outlaw is anyone who lives outside the law. Though legend portrays Robin and his men as good outlaws, we can't really be sure of this. Early ballads suggest that Robin was fairly bloodthirsty and cut off the heads of his enemies, including the Sheriff of Nottingham. If that was so, then where might the good reputation of Robin come from? Well, you have to consider the times in which Robin lived. The feudal system was breaking down as the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. There was a lot of corruption in the upper class. It seems that Robin's enemies were only those who were unjust, unfair, and overtaxing the poor. In particular, King John, Richard the Lionheart's brother, who became King of England after Richard died, was severely overtaxing the peasants in England. So when Robin was out cutting off heads, he was supposedly doing so to defend his fellow countrymen. Or so the legend goes. Sherwood Forest. Now, let me explain the part about Sherwood Forest, which is a real forest that still exists today. You see, in medieval England, forest was the name of any land, not just an area with trees, that was designated by the king or wealthy nobles as their own private property. So why was Robin living there in a hideout? It could be that he was hiding there because he wasn't allowed there. And the reason he would want to be in the forest would be that the land was full of animals to hunt. Robin and his outlaws may have just been trying to survive. There is really nothing glorious about that. Maid Marian. Speaking of romance, as I mentioned earlier, the first ballads of Robin give no mention of a girlfriend in his unstable life. But in 1280, someone wrote a French romance that used the names of Robin and Marian. Once Marian showed up, she stuck around, making the tale just a little more interesting and far more romantic. Friar Tuck. Another character who has stuck around is Friar Tuck. A friar, by the way, is a special kind of monk. Friar Tuck was first introduced in a play in 1475. His character was probably based on a real-life priest named Robert Stafford. Originally, Friar Tuck was described as serious and devout. Over time, though, Friar Tuck became a jolly but irresponsible fellow. Sadly enough, his character may have rightly reflected the lazy way that some of the friars lived in the early Renaissance, just before the Reformation. In the 1800s, the story of Robin Hood came to a real peak through the brilliant authorship of Sir Walter Scott. He wrote Ivanhoe, a work of historical fiction. In this masterpiece of literature, Robin Hood, called Robert of Loxley in the story, teams up with others to help Richard the Lionhearted defeat his rival brother, John. It is from Scott's description of Loxley that we have our more modern portrait of Robin Hood. Robin became a popular folk hero because of his generosity to the poor and downtrodden peasants, and his hatred of the sheriff and his verderers who enforced the oppressive forest laws, made him their champion. Some chroniclers date his exploits as taking place during the reign of Edward II, but other versions say the king was Richard I, the Lionheart. Robin having fought in the Crusades alongside the Lionheart before returning to England to find his lands seized by the Sheriff. All versions of the Robin Hood story give the same account of his death. As he grew older and became ill, he went with Little John to Kirklees Priory near Huddersfield, to be treated by his aunt, the prioress, but a certain Sir Roger de Doncaster persuaded her to murder her nephew, and the prioress slowly bled Robin to death. With the last of his strength he blew his horn and Little John came to his aid, but too late. Little John placed Robin's bow in his hand and carried him to a window from where Robin managed to loose one arrow. Robin asked Little John to bury him where the arrow landed, which he duly did. A mound in Kirklees Park, within bowshot of the house, can still be seen and is said to be his last resting place. Little John's grave can be seen in Hathersage churchyard in Derbyshire. But what of his lover Maid Marian? Not much of Robin's career is known, but nowhere in the chronicles is Maid Marian mentioned, so we must assume she was added to the stories at a later date. So what do you think? Was the story of Robin Hood really true?